This is Binny, and he can see into the future. Also, he's a ghost. So, this is the story. It all begins just over 100 years ago in a small rural village within the rugged mountains of the Minecraft world. Now, this village was not home to very many villagers anymore, as many of its inhabitants had fled this place to go and live an easier life elsewhere. As really, life within that particular village was extremely difficult, as very few crops could grow there, very few animals could survive, and oftentimes the villagers within that town just didn't have the resources to stay warm in the winter. And so for that reason, many of them would freeze to death. So it really just was not a pleasant experience. But still, despite all those struggles, many villagers still decided to stay there within that village. And one of those villagers was called Binny. Now, Binny was born in that village and he grew up there. However, his entire family had fled that place long ago, as they just couldn't take it anymore. Yet, still, Binny remained in that village, along with the 500 or so other inhabitants, as he, unlike many others, just loved it there. Now, his reasons for staying were that the villagers within the town were just so kind and friendly, and those mountains that they were surrounded by, well, he just loved them. And the final, most important reason for why he stayed was that the vast cave networks that surrounded them and the mountains were just stunning, as everything within them just mesmerized Binny, and he would never not be amazed with what was there, as every single detail within those caves were just perfect in Binny's eyes. And so it was due to his love and obsession with those caves that Binny would, over the next few decades, memorize every single detail within all of the caves in the local vicinity. It was very impressive, and all the other villagers were actually inspired by Binny's hard work and his enjoyment that he derived from spending almost every single second of every day within those caves. And so, all was good, as everyone was happy and safe. Well, actually, not quite, as one snowstorm would change everything. As it was on one winter night that a snowstorm began to develop over the mountains. And well, seeing this, Binny decided to venture deep within one of their caves, as this night also had one of the brightest aurora borealises that he had ever witnessed. And so he was facing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, as he knew that deep down in one of the caves on the south side of the mountains was a beautiful underwater lake. And right now, with the snowstorm and the aurora borealis, it was likely more picturesque than it ever had been before. And so, for that reason, Binny was desperate to see it, and thus he began to make his way down to it. However, before he was able to, the cave that he was standing in collapsed. In fact, half the mountain collapsed, as all that snow from that storm put enough pressure on the weakly held up caves to the point of destruction. Now, when this happened, all the villagers heard was just a loud crashing sound, and so many of them ran out of their houses to see what had happened. And well, when they saw that half of a mountain had collapsed, they all understood what happened. And so many began to think that Binny, who was in that general area, must have died. And well, this fact was proved to the villagers when over 10 days later, and Binny still hadn't returned. That was it, they thought. Binny truly had died there. Now, many were sad, as Binny was a key member of their society, but at the same time, they were just happy to know that he died doing what he loved. Except, no, he didn't actually die. Well, kind of. As in a physical form, yes, he was dead. But in a spiritual form, he remained living, as his soul, for some reason, did not rise to the heavens or fall down to the hells when he died. No. Instead, his soul, over the next 10 days, solidified and allowed BINNY to live another life. And so, once he was reborn, at last, then BINNY slowly made his way out of that collapsed cave. And then he returned to the village. Now, as soon as he did this, all the villagers just stopped what they were doing, and they all came over to stare at this new BINNY, as they were just in complete shock that he was alive right now, as they were genuinely convinced that he was dead. He just had to be. But no, he clearly wasn't, as he was just standing there right in front of them in a blue soul state. This just didn't make any sense, as how was BINNY able to survive that? And even if he did survive that, how was he able to live 10 days without food or clean water? And why did he look like a ghost? The villagers just didn't see any logical reason for any of those questions. And so, that made all the villagers believe that the only possibility that BINNY was still alive was that he must be a godly entity. And so, believing that, they all began to bow down to BINNY. Now, BINNY was just so confused. As to him, he just felt as if he had gone to sleep for a few hours, and he was just annoyed that he had missed that golden opportunity for that picturesque scene, and that he was just coming home as normal. So, why were they all bowing down to him? But then he saw his reflection, and his entire worldview shifted, as he couldn't believe that he was now humanoid, and that he was, well, blue and transparent. He looked like a ghost, and so he stood back, and for the next few hours, he just remained still, as he was both horrified and intrigued with what he had become. But while he was doing that, the villagers were off, as they were now on a mission to honor and worship this new god within their world. And so it would be over the next few hours that those villagers will build a monument to BINNY. And so, once they'd completed that project, just a few hours later, they then lured BINNY to go and have a look at it. And well, the moment that he saw it, he fell in love with it, as it was built within a cave and was made from all his favourite stones. It was amazing. In fact, that monument was so well built that BINNY decided to make it his new home. And so once the villagers knew that that was what BINNY wanted, they created a small bedroom for him to reside in. And well, after that, things would begin to change for the better within that village. As now BINNY, with all of his ghost powers, was able to help the villagers more than anything ever could have in the past. And he was more than willing to do that, as the villagers had built him a monument after all. And so it would be then that BINNY would spend a few hours every single day helping the villagers. This might have been by him directing them to hidden underwater reservoirs that only he could see due to his ability to float through blocks. And that water could then be used in farming, meaning less people would die of starvation. Or he might be able to go through the walls of the mountains, which allowed him to give the villagers warnings of incoming raiders. Or he might even just go and find some hidden emerald ores, which the villagers just adored. And so in return for all this help that BINNY was giving, many of the villagers would leave gifts in the monument. Now, they said they did this to return the thanks to BINNY, but really, most of the villagers were doing this because they were secretly hoping that by showing their generosity that they too, one day, might be granted with the same powers as him. But despite the villagers' slight selfish attitude, all was good in the world, as everyone was happy. But then, one day, while Binny was in the caves, something happened. Something that would change Binny forever. As while in that cave, his eyes suddenly began to glow in a light blue hue. Now, this was blinding to anyone who was around to see it. But to Binny, he was just starting to gain the vision of something magical, as he was beginning to see the future. As it was only now that Binny had just uncovered another power that he had gained from becoming this ghostly spirit, that being future sight. He was shocked. And so it would be over the next few months that Binny would stay deep in that cave, remaining alone, as he was going to try and attempt to master this ability. And whilst he was doing that, he didn't want any distractions. And so it would be, after months of constant hard work without being disrupted by anyone, he did it. He had perfected the ability of future sight. And so, once he was ready, then he began to head back up to the surface, where he would then tell all the villagers about his new powers. However, at first, no one believed him. As well, yes, Binny might be a powerful ghostly deity, it just didn't sound possible for him to be able to see into the future. Well, from their perspective anyways. And so, because of that, many villagers just began to walk away, thinking that Binny was just trying to take advantage of them and was just trying to extort them for more gifts, which really disappointed many of them. But then, just as they were walking away, Binny yelled out to all the villagers,
"Don't cross that river! There's a pack of polar bears on the other side waiting for you, and they will kill 17 of you! I can see it happening!"
All the villagers froze, and then they heard it, the silent breathing of a polar bear. And so they all began to stare at the Binny, as how did he know that there were polar bears there? As they were almost never here in the village, so it couldn't just have been a random guess. And so because of that, many of them began to believe that Binny could actually see into the future. However, there was a group of 17 villagers who were further away from the polar bears, and so they didn't hear them breathing, and thus they all thought that Binny was just being nonsensical, and that there would be no possible way that polar bears could be here within their village. And so with that, they ignored the warning and began to walk over that river. And well, let's just say they really should have listened, as all 17 of them were killed. And so, after his prediction was proved to be entirely truthful, all the villagers began to bow down to Binny, as he could actually see into the future. And so, they all began to worship him. Now, seeing this, with all the villagers submitting and worshipping to him, made Binny feel very, very powerful, as he now had complete control of the entire village, as he was now their leader, and he could do anything he wanted. But still, Binny was a good soul, and he wanted to use his degree of authority over the villagers to benefit everyone. And so, for that reason, he ordered the villagers to get into groups, and then together, in those groups, the villagers would be directed, guided, and ordered to build a much better village. As now, Binny had one group mining woods, another processing that wood, another moving that wood, another building with it, and another perfecting the builds. And so together, they were able to create a village that would allow for much better survivability within the winters. And would also just be a nicer place to live, with an improved quality of life. And so, once the village had been completely transformed, then Binny began to give out predictions for their future, and all the villagers were fascinated. But still, Binny knew that he couldn't reveal too much to the villagers, or else he might cause a paradox to occur, which would be devastating for the entire universe. But still, it was interesting enough to hear about the future that legends would begin to spread about Binny all across the world, and thus villagers all over the world would then travel tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of blocks, just to hear Binny speak of the future. So, all was good, as Binny was getting more and more attention and recognition, and their village was now thriving with riches, and so nothing bad whatsoever was happening. However, once again, everything would change, as it was on one dark rainy night that a group of young villagers made the decision to break into Binny's cave, as they wanted to see Binny for themselves and ask for future predictions specific to themselves. And so, they carefully made their way past the heavily guarded security walls and were able to sneak over to Binny's bedroom. He was asleep, so they had to be very cautious and quiet now, and not to shock the Binny too much. And so, they began to sneak closer and closer to him, when one of them accidentally jumped into a puddle, which made quite a loud sound, and thus Binny was suddenly awoken. And well, as he was used to the constant peace within his monument, his instincts of flight or fight mode kicked in, and well, unluckily for the younglings, this time he was in fight mode. And so, without even thinking, Binny lunged into an attack, and in just a few seconds, he had killed half of the group, and greatly injured the other half. Wait, no, these young villagers were not a threat, they were just young villagers, and Binny had just realized that. Oh no, this was bad, very bad, as what he did was all wrong, and the other villagers would likely be outraged when they find out what he just did. And so Binny immediately started to prepare for abandoning this monument, as he intended to never return to it again, as he was just so ashamed with what he had done. And so Binny began to pick up as many seeds as he possibly could, along with any other necessities that he could hold. But he wasn't fast enough, as one of those injured villagers was able to run back to the village, where they would then tell all the villagers about what happened. And well, once the villagers heard the story, just as Binny had predicted, they were outraged, as there was no reason for Binny to act like that. These were just defenseless young villagers, and so all the villagers were getting very, very angry at Binny, and they all wanted revenge. And so with that, they all began to charge into the caves where Binny resided, and would have the full intention of killing him. Now, Binny was not expecting there to be such a large army of villagers, but still, he knew what he had to do. He just had to run and get away from the villagers, as he really just didn't want to hurt anyone else. And so, holding everything they had gathered so far, he began to run. But he couldn't go fast enough, and he saw that in the future, if he continued to run, then he was going to be caught up with, and he was going to be killed. So really, he only had one other option, and that was to fight back. Now, he really just did not want to do that, but he had to, and so he turned around and began to punch back with his full might and power. And so in just a few minutes, he was able to kill 60% of that army. And so, once he had done that, the remaining villagers fled. However, despite the fact that the rest of the villagers were now gone, he could still feel the immense loss of life within that cave. Not only in a metaphorical sense, but also in a literal sense, as a large amount of blood from those slain was now coating Binny and was staining him permanently. And thus, Binny was given a demonic, evil appearance. But even after defeating that army and gaining this evil appearance, Binny still knew that he had to isolate himself, as who knows what he might accidentally do in the future. And so he just couldn't risk causing any more harm to the world. And thus, it was then that Binny went up to the surface and blocked off his cave permanently. And then he ventured deeper into the cave network than he had in decades. However, as he began to descend within the world, something very odd began to happen to him, as Binny began to glow in a bright, white hue. Now, this was very strange, as this has just never happened before. But at the same time, this was amazing and would be very useful, as this new glowing effect allowed Binny to have a much clearer vision of the area that he was travelling through. And so it would be, over the next few decades, that Binny would be able to explore millions of miles worth of caves, would be able to play with the rats within the underground, and would swim in the magical underground lakes. And yet, despite being lonely for all of this, Binny loved this new life, as it was just so much simpler, as he just didn't have to help any villagers anymore. He didn't have to predict the future. He didn't have to worry about anything. And so he could just exist peacefully. And so, life was great. And Binny made a decision that, from now on, he would never leave the underground. But soon, on one dark, rainy night, he would be forced to question that belief, as the entire universe would depend on him. As it was on one dark night, while Binny was just sitting on a boat, drifting along the underground lake, looking onto the future, as he normally would, when he saw something, as he was witnessing endless corruption and death consuming the surface of the overworld. And then, just minutes later, everything went black. This was bad, very bad, as he was now aware that their entire world was merely days away from complete annihilation. And so Binny knew that he had to warn everyone of what was to come. And thus, he had to make the decision to leave the underground and make his way to the surface and over to his home village. However, as soon as he arrived back at that village, he was chased away, as the villagers just didn't want anything to do with this murdering monster. And so Binny tried to shout out and warn the others, but no one cared. They only knew Binny as an evil demon. And thus, it was just hours later when his vision would come into fruition, as the entire world would be consumed in corruption, and everyone would die just minutes later. But still, despite all this death and suffering, not all hope was lost just yet, as Binny, during this infection of corruption, was killed once again, and this time was transformed into a floating soul. He was still alive and conscious, and so he can now save everyone if he could just reverse his corruption somehow. And luckily, he knew exactly how he might be able to save everyone using some of his powers. But to learn what he did and what happened next, then you'll need to watch this video.